June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The ships creaked into harbour after 2 long weeks at sea. Exhausted German prisoners gripped the rails, bracing for chains, insults, maybe even fists. Instead, what they saw made them freeze. Black and white dock workers lifting crates together, women in overalls driving cranes, a brass band playing cheerful tunes, and the smell of hot coffee and donuts drifting through the air. It was the first crack in everything they had been told about America. What happened next shocked them even more, and it's a story that will change how you see the war itself. Stay with us, and if you love hidden history like this, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and support the channel so we can bring you more untold stories from World War II. June 4, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The moment was thick with diesel fumes and salt spray, the creak of mooring lines echoing against steel hulls. From the troopship stepped 2,500 men of the Africa Corps, their boots clanging against the pier. They expected hostility, spittle, perhaps a bayonet in the back. Instead, they walked into a scene that seemed absurdly ordinary. Dock workers shouting orders, cranes swinging containers of grain, children hawking newspapers, and the faint crackle of a baseball game carried by a radio. The irony was immediate. These were men indoctrinated to believe America was weak, decadent, racially divided. Yet before their first hour ashore had passed, they saw black and white workers loading cargo side by side, women operating heavy machinery with practiced ease, and sailors laughing as if a war were not raging across the globe. "We thought the US was in chaos," one prisoner later recalled, but everything was running like a clock. Norfolk Naval Base itself was overwhelming. More than 4,300 acres of piers, warehouses, and dry docks, an expanse larger than many German towns. The cranes alone dwarfed what most of these men had seen in Hamburg, a port once touted as the Reich's pride. Records show that in 1943, Norfolk handled more than 30 million tons of cargo, triple Hamburg's best pre-war year. The message was unspoken yet clear. America's strength was not only in weapons, but in industry humming at full tilt. Even the escorting guards seemed oddly relaxed. They carried rifles, yes, but many slung casually at their sides. Prisoners were not cuffed nor shackled in lines. Instead, they were herded like tired cattle, but cattle given dignity. "We were astonished," wrote one captured officer, "that they let us look freely at their port, their trains, their factories. They showed no fear of us seeing these things. Shots." It was a paradox that gnawed at certainty. Why hide nothing from an enemy? The sensory contrasts seared into memory. The metallic sting of the salt air mixed with the sweet aroma of fried dough from a vendor cart. The clang of steel plates blended with the laughter of sailors reading the comic strip in the morning paper. And always the radio cutting through the noise with a baseball announcer's voice. Top of the third. Yankees lead 3-1. For men raised on Hitler's speeches, it was a surreal soundtrack. Many later confessed to an internal dissonance. Nazi propaganda had painted America as fractured, plagued by unemployment, incapable of unity. Yet here was evidence of another truth: prosperity, energy, and casual abundance. As one German sergeant scribbled in a smuggled note, "If this is how they live during war, what must it be like in peace?" The arrival at Norfolk was more than a logistical transfer. It was the first strike against an edifice of belief, the beginning of what would become a psychological campaign more potent than any leaflet dropped from the sky. These men had not yet seen the inside of a camp, nor tasted American rations, nor witnessed the reach of its farms and factories. But the first impressions mattered. The unexpected sight of America's normalcy was already eroding the image of a weak, crumbling foe. But Norfolk was only a doorway. What lay beyond would intensify the paradox until it became undeniable. For when the trains began to move inland, the Germans discovered something even stranger than a port without fear. A society that lived its private life openly, as though inviting them to watch. The trains waited just beyond the piers, their passenger coaches gleaming in the Virginia sun. Not boxcars, not cattle trucks, passenger coaches. Prisoners blinked at the sight. In Europe, transport meant cramped wagons reeking of hay and sweat. Here, cushioned benches and open windows. A guard gestured them aboard, almost casually. "Sit wherever you like," one remembered him saying. The paradox grew sharper as the train lurched westward. Instead of secret detours, the route cut straight through towns and farmland. Through open windows, prisoners glimpsed ordinary American life in full color. Men mowing lawns, children licking ice cream cones, young couples strolling with arms entwined. At Richmond's Union Station, civilians on the platforms stared back. curious, not hostile. A few even waved. I felt as though I was invisible, a German corporal later wrote. No one shouted, no one cursed. It was as if we did not matter. The abundance visible from the rails was staggering. Factories belched smoke but showed no signs of scarcity. Automobile lots brimmed with new trucks. Along the Baltimore route, the train passed so close to the Glenn L. Martin aircraft plant that prisoners could count the half-finished bombers on the assembly line. In 1 week alone, Martin's workers rolled out more than 30 B-26 Marauders, a number equal to a month's production from Germany's Heinkel works. They did not hide this from us, another POW recalled in disbelief. They wanted us to see. Even the small details impressed themselves on memory. In station diners, American passengers ate hamburgers stacked high with onions and tomatoes, meals that looked impossibly rich to men accustomed to black bread and watery soup. At one stop, a prisoner saw a porter discard half an apple into a bin. I could not believe such waste, he confessed years later. The smell of fresh coffee drifting into the carriages was torture and revelation at once. Numbers underscored the impression. By 1943, the US rail network moved more than 2.5 million passengers per day, along with freight that dwarfed Germany's capacity. Coal output stood at 600 million tons annually, double the Reich's. For German soldiers taught to believe in their nation's industrial supremacy, the statistics were not abstract. They were visible mile after mile, in every water tower, every siding stacked with grain, every whistle of a freight hauling steel. The journey also carried a psychological lesson. These prisoners were not hidden from the American public. The government had no fear that civilians might panic at the sight of their enemies. Instead, civilians were allowed to witness and to compare. Many did so with curiosity, even compassion. Newspapers of the period carried small reports of German POWs glimpsed at stations, often noting their youth, their neat uniforms, their weary faces. A few families even pressed sandwiches through the train windows. For the prisoners, this openness was disarming. One diary fragment put it plainly. In Germany, we would never let captives see our cities, never let them near our people. Here, they put us on display. It was humiliating and strange, but it made us doubt. Doubt, after all, was contagious. If America had nothing to fear from showing itself, perhaps its strength was greater than the Reich had admitted. The trains rolled on, their steel wheels hammering a rhythm across bridges and valleys. Every mile took the Germans deeper into a land that was not collapsing under war, but thriving in spite of it. They had arrived expecting to glimpse propaganda. Instead, they were given reality in full view. But the most astonishing revelation was still to come. Beyond the stations and factories waited the camps themselves, places that would overturn every expectation of captivity, beginning with something as simple and as radical as medicine. When the trains finally reached their destinations, many prisoners braced for the worst. Captivity, in their minds, meant straw on stone floors, thin soup, disease untreated. In German camps, Allied prisoners had learned to expect just that. Yet the moment German POWs entered American compounds, they encountered a contradiction that rattled them to the core. Doctors waiting, nurses prepared, and medicine that seemed closer to a miracle than to military necessity. One of the first things they noticed was the Red Cross parcels stacked neatly in storerooms, some stamped kosher in Hebrew lettering. Others contained items unheard of on German ration tables: chocolate, tinned meat, even cigarettes. For Muslim prisoners from North Africa, halal options were arranged. A Swiss inspector touring Camp Herne in 1943 wrote in his report that medical care here equals, and in some cases exceeds, the treatment received by American soldiers themselves. The statistics confirmed it. By 1944, the US military had produced more than 20 billion units of penicillin, while Germany, constrained by limited fermentation capacity, had produced only a few hundred kilos of crude forms. To a captured soldier who had seen comrades die of infected wounds in Africa, the sight of an American medic injecting penicillin into a fellow POW was not just startling. It was civilization turned upside down. They used this medicine on us as if we were their own, one remembered. We could not imagine such a thing. The paradox deepened in the hospitals. German physicians who had been captured were often allowed to continue practicing under American supervision. Side by side with American doctors, they treated their own comrades, swapping knowledge in the process. It was an unspoken gesture of respect. The enemy was an enemy, but still a professional. We were surprised by the collegial tone, Dr. Wilhelm Krantz later wrote. No one mocked us. They asked questions, shared techniques. It was not a victor and a vanquished, but colleagues in a white coat. Sensory impressions reinforced the message. The antiseptic sting of carbolic acid, the steady hum of electric fans in recovery wards, the crisp cotton of clean sheets. These were luxuries absent from most field hospitals in Europe. To POWs, it was as if they had stepped from a medieval infirmary into a modern clinic overnight. Numbers added weight to these impressions. Official US reports show that in 1943 alone, more than 16,000 German prisoners were admitted to military hospitals, with survival rates above 95%. In the Reich's own medical system, survival after compound fractures or pneumonia was often below 70%. The contrast was stark enough to silence even the most ardent believers in German superiority. And the food, always the food. In camp mess halls, prisoners were astonished to find menus posted in German. Rations averaged 3,400 calories per day, compared to the meager 1,500 at many German installations. Eggs, potatoes, beef and coffee were served regularly. At Camp Herne, a Christmas menu listed turkey with dressing, cranberry sauce, mashed potatoes, buttered peas, pumpkin pie, and even cigars afterward. One prisoner later wrote, "It was a feast beyond the imagination of our families at home." This was not sentimental charity. It was deliberate policy, rooted in the Geneva Convention and in Washington's calculation that humane treatment would yield dividends. Still, to men shaped by years of propaganda about Anglo-American cruelty, it felt like stepping into another world. "We thought they would starve us," a former sergeant confessed decades later. "Instead, we gained weight." The contradiction was impossible to ignore. They were prisoners, yes, but healthier, cleaner, and better feet than they had been in uniform. It was as if America had chosen to fight tyranny not just with bullets, but with abundance itself. Yet abundance was only part of the shock. For when the prisoners were moved beyond the hospital wards and into the rhythm of camp life, they discovered another paradox. One written not in medicine or menus, but in the freedom to see America itself from the windows of their guarded trains. The rumble of wheels carried the prisoners deeper inland into the American heartland. Guards sat casually on benches, rifles resting on their knees, while the men who only months before had worn the Afrika Korps insignia stared through open windows. What they saw contradicted everything they had been taught. Instead of secrecy and blackout curtains, America seemed to lay itself bare. Trains rattled past sprawling factories with gates wide open, their smokestacks pumping columns of black and white into the sky. Near Baltimore, the Glen L. Martin plant rose like a cathedral of steel and glass. Inside, visible even from the rail line, rows of B-26 Marauders stretched wingtip to wingtip. Prisoners counted dozens at various stages of assembly. They did not hide their production, one POW marveled. They let us see how many machines they could build, and they wanted us to see. The numbers backed the spectacle. In 1943 alone, Martin produced nearly 1,200 bombers. By comparison, Germany's Heinkel factory, harassed by raids and shortages, struggled to deliver a fraction of that. America's openness was its own kind of psychological warfare, not camouflage, but confidence. Stations along the way sharpened the paradox. At Richmond's Union Station, the Germans glimpsed civilian families embracing soldiers, vendors selling sandwiches, and a porter shouting train times. No one rushed to hide them from view. A few civilians stared in curiosity, some even smiled or waved. For men accustomed to thinking of themselves as hated enemies, the absence of hatred was disarming. Then came the small, sharper details. A cafeteria window revealed passengers eating hamburgers stacked high with lettuce and tomato. The rich scent of frying onions drifted into the cars. At one stop, a porter bit into a bright red apple and casually tossed the half-eaten fruit into a bin. A German corporal would later recall, "I had not seen such waste since before the war. In that moment I knew they had more than they could eat." The statistics of abundance matched the sensory overload. American farms harvested nearly 3.2 billion bushels of corn in 1943, while Germany, strangled by blockades and shortages, eked out less than half that in grain of all types. The US rail system carried 2.5 million passengers daily, while still moving unprecedented tonnage of coal, steel and food. To the Germans on those trains, the endless lines of freight cars, grain hoppers, oil tankers, flatbeds stacked with jeeps, seemed limitless. The soundscape told its own story, the mournful whistle of locomotives echoing across valleys, the steady clatter of steel wheels, the bursts of laughter from civilians on the platforms. Even the hum of neon signs above station diners seemed like proof of an economy untouched by want. For the prisoners, this visibility was almost unbearable. In Germany, prisoners of war were hidden, their transport disguised, their exposure to civilian life tightly controlled. Here, the Americans seemed to flaunt their prosperity. It was humiliation mixed with awe, one diary entry recorded. We saw their people, their machines, their food, their freedom, and they were not afraid to show us. The openness served a purpose. Washington knew that visible abundance could erode enemy ideology faster than lectures ever could. It was a demonstration of strength without firing a shot. And for many Germans, it planted the first seeds of doubt. If their leaders had lied about America's weakness, what else had they lied about? But the trains were only conduits. Their destination was even more shocking. The prisoner of war camps themselves. There, the paradox would deepen. For instead of cruelty and deprivation, the Germans found amenities, wages, and even holiday celebrations that rivaled what soldiers at the front could only dream of. When the gates of Camp Hearn in Texas swung open, the Germans entered a world that seemed impossible for captives. Spread across 720 acres, with rows of white barracks, orderly streets, and even a hospital wing, the camp looked less like a prison than a small American town. Built in December 1942 by the Army Corps of Engineers, it was designed to hold 4,800 men, a number greater than the population of Hearn itself. The first paradox struck immediately. Electricity in every barrack. Ceiling fans stirred the humid Texas air, while light bulbs glowed at the flick of a switch. Many Germans had grown up in villages where electricity was scarce. Now, as prisoners, they lived in huts wired to the grid. I thought it was a trick, one POW admitted later. How could the enemy give us better conditions than some of our homes in Germany? The camp hospital reinforced that shock. Equipped with modern surgical tools, stocked with penicillin, and staffed by both American and German doctors, it became a place where enemies healed together. In 1943 alone, more than 1,200 prisoners passed through its wards, with survival rates that matched or exceeded those of American GIs. The antiseptic smell of carbolic solution, the clean sheets, the buzz of fluorescent lights, all of it impressed on the prisoners that this was no ordinary captivity. Food became a daily revelation. Men accustomed to rations of turnip soup and black bread suddenly found themselves eating 3,400 calories a day. Breakfasts of eggs and bacon, dinners of beef stew and potatoes, even coffee with sugar. Loose. Juries unimaginable in the Reich. At Christmas 1943, Camp Hearn staged a feast that seemed plucked from a dream. Roast turkey with dressing, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie, and cigars. It was not propaganda, one officer remembered. We ate until we could not move. We prisoners ate like kings while our families starved. Even money flowed in the camp, though in the form of scrip. Each prisoner received 80 cents a day, the same base pay as an American private, to spend at the canteen. Shelves stocked with cigarettes, soap, writing paper, and even harmonicas offered choices they had never expected. The jingle of coins was replaced by paper chits, but the sensation was the same. Autonomy within captivity. The sensory details were unforgettable. The crack of a baseball bat echoed from the recreation field. The smell of roasted peanuts drifted from the canteen. The texture of fresh uniforms, laundered weekly, felt almost decadent compared to the lice-ridden tunics they had worn in Africa. One prisoner wrote, "It was captivity, yes, but it felt like another country was adopting us." Numbers underscored the experience. By 1945, more than 400 major POW camps dotted the United States, holding a total of 425,000 German prisoners. At Camp Hearn alone, over 3,000 volunteered for outside labor at nearby farms and mills, while hundreds enrolled in camp-run classes. The scale was staggering, captivity not as punishment, but as management on an industrial scale. But perhaps the most shocking moment came not from rations or wages, but from ritual. On Christmas Eve, local families donated decorations, and a massive pine tree was erected in the mess hall. American guards sang carols alongside their captives. "I cried," one soldier confessed, "because the enemy celebrated our holy night with us, while our Führer gave us only war." This was the deepest paradox of all. The enemy, instead of breaking them, treated them with decency. It planted doubts no amount of Nazi indoctrination could erase. For if America's prisoners were cared for better than Germany's citizens, what did that say about the world they had fought to defend? But life inside the camps was only part of the story. Beyond the fences, new surprises awaited, the chance to work, to earn, and to witness firsthand the staggering scale of American agriculture and industry. When the Germans first volunteered for labor duty beyond the barbed wire, they braced for humiliation. They expected shackles, snarling guards, and hostile farmers. Instead, They found themselves driven in trucks to vast fields of cotton, wheat and corn, landscapes so endless they seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. The paradox was immediate. Men who had once marched under Rommel's banners now stooped to harvest peanuts in Texas or oranges in Florida. Yet they were not degraded. They were paid. The numbers astonished them. By 1944, nearly 200,000 German POWs were working outside the camps, filling gaps left by American men now serving overseas. In Texas alone, more than 20,000 prisoners helped save the cotton harvest, ensuring 3 million bales reached wartime factories. In Iowa, POWs picked corn by the ton. In Georgia, they helped gather 50% of the state's peanut crop. What began as labor soon became an education in abundance. The sensory experience was unlike anything in war. Under the relentless southern sun, the sweet smell of hay mixed with the tang of diesel from tractors, machines far larger and more numerous than anything they had seen back home. The calloused feel of cotton bolls and the rough scrape of peanut vines reminded them of the land, but the sheer scale of mechanization stunned them. We realized, one POW wrote later, that America could feed not just its own people, but the whole world if it wished. Farmers, at first suspicious, grew accustomed to their unlikely workers. Some greeted them with cold stares, others with quiet hospitality. Many brought watermelons, sandwiches, or jars of iced tea into the fields, offerings of humanity to men who had been enemies weeks before. A Texas farmer's wife remembered, "They were polite, hard-working boys. Sometimes I forgot they were prisoners at all." The paradox deepened with freedom. After the day's labor, guards often let them ride in the back of trucks through small towns. They saw schoolchildren laughing on bicycles, neon signs flickering outside diners, and families shopping in stores stocked with goods. For men from a Germany of ration books and bombed-out shops, it felt like peering into another world. Even their wages, though modest, reshaped their lives. Paid in camp scrip, they could buy chocolate, tobacco, or even English language books. Some used their earnings to send Red Cross parcels back to Europe. In a twist of irony, men captured in war now fed their families at home better than some soldiers still fighting on the front lines. The statistics were staggering. By the war's end, German POWs had contributed more than 90 million man-days of labor across the United States. They harvested crops, felled timber, built roads, and even worked in paper mills and factories. Productivity soared. The United States had turned prisoners into a workforce, not through coercion, but through contracts. Yet the most profound lessons were not measured in calories or wages. They came in human encounters. A farmer's daughter recalled how one prisoner, fluent in English, helped her with algebra homework. Another remembered POWs playing violins at a barn dance, their music drifting into the night as American and German families listened together. These moments left T. Prisoners unsettled. They had been told America was soulless, materialistic, and cruel. Instead, they found kindness in strangers. For the men who worked the fields, each passing day eroded the propaganda they had believed. The Reich had promised a 1,000-year empire. Here, in the open plains of Texas or the orchards of California, they saw a society that fed both its captives and its citizens. The clang of tractor engines, the laughter of farm children, the smell of fresh bread from rural kitchens. These became the memories that endured longer than the clamour of battle. But beyond the fields and workshops, another transformation awaited. Education, art, and unexpected exchanges of culture began to unfold behind the fences. Changes that would shape not only the prisoners' view of America, but their own identity. Behind the wire, life in the camps became more than survival. It became a classroom, a stage, and a canvas. What began as captivity evolved into a paradox of freedom. German prisoners, stripped of their uniforms, were given the tools to build their minds. Camp commanders, advised by the Geneva Convention and eager to counter Nazi ideology, encouraged education. By 1944, dozens of camps hosted what were known as POW universities. At Camp Herne, German officers organized courses in mathematics, engineering, English, and philosophy. American textbooks were supplied, chalk squeaked across blackboards, and evenings buzzed with debate. Over 25,000 POWs across the United States took part in such programs, some earning certificates later recognized back in Germany. One prisoner admitted, "We had more time to study in captivity than we ever had at home. For us, it was a university behind barbed wire." Music and theatre thrived as well. Using scrap wood, cardboard, and paint, prisoners built stages inside mess halls. They performed Beethoven and Mozart, but also comedies and Shakespeare. Violins whined, pianos rang, and voices rose in harmony. Guards and local townsfolk sometimes came to watch, marveling at the skill of men once seen only as enemies. The sensory contrast was sharp. They had been taught to see Americans as ruthless enemies, yet in towns and farms across the United States, they were met with handshakes, meals, and kindness. It often began with work details. A group of prisoners sent to repair fences in Nebraska returned with stories not of hostility, but of neighbors bringing them lemonade. In Minnesota, women on farms baked pies for the young Germans after a day's threshing. One POW later confessed, "We expected hatred. Instead, we tasted apple pie. The smell of cinnamon, the warmth of kitchens, the laughter of children." These details cut deeper than any lecture could. The paradox widened in American towns. In Texas, guards sometimes escorted prisoners into local shops, where they marveled at shelves brimming with goods, coffee, canned peaches, shoes in every size. One German officer whispered, "Our people have nothing like this. How can they say America is poor and decadent?" For men from bombed-out Cologne or Hamburg, the contrast was almost unbearable. Numbers told the story too. Across 46 states, thousands of POWs left camps daily for labor, moving among civilians. By 1945, over 90% of German prisoners in America had some contact with local communities. More than 30% reported being invited to family homes for meals or Sunday services. The statistics showed what propaganda could not erase. Ordinary Americans saw them as men, not monsters. Diaries and letters home revealed the emotional toll. One soldier from Württemberg described being invited to sit at a farmer's table. "They placed me at the head, poured me milk and gave me roast beef. I thought of my family, hungry at home, and could not stop my tears." Another wrote of a Christmas dinner in Kansas, where he joined in carols with the family that hosted him. "I sang Silent Night with my enemies, and for the first time I questioned what kind of war this was." The sensory imprints were overwhelming. The taste of buttered corn on the cob, the crack of baseball bats in a park, the sight of children running barefoot in fields unscarred by bombs. These were not images of an enemy. They were glimpses of a life free from the chains. In Europe, bombs shattered opera houses. In Texas, prisoners rebuilt culture from planks and nails. Art was another revelation. Prisoners sketched portraits of guards, carved wooden figurines, and painted landscapes of the very land that confined them. Some crafted elaborate murals on barrack walls. The smell of turpentine mixed with the dust of Texas wind, creating workshops that felt more like art schools than prisons. A Red Cross observer noted, "The creativity of the German POWs astonished us. They turned boredom into beauty." But perhaps the most disarming paradox was how Americans tolerated, even respected, their captives' traditions. On Sundays, German chaplains held Lutheran or Catholic services. Hymns floated into the warm air, sometimes echoing against the guard towers where young American soldiers listened in silence. At Christmas, camps allowed tree decorations, nativity plays, and even choral concerts. For many prisoners, it was the first time they realized their captors not only permitted their culture, but honored it. Statistics underscored the phenomenon. By 1945, more than 3,000 plays, concerts, and exhibitions had been staged in American POW camps. Over 40% of prisoners participated in some form of cultural activity, from orchestras to lecture halls. These numbers revealed a quiet revolution. Men who had once carried rifles were now carrying books, instruments, and paintbrushes. And with every page turned, every note played, the Nazi worldview eroded further. Propaganda had painted America as a wasteland of greed and violence. Yet here, prisoners discovered Shakespeare in translation, jazz records spinning on phonographs, and American guards humming along to German carols. A private from Bavaria later reflected, "In the Reich, culture was used as a weapon. In America, culture was given to us as a gift. The sensory details stuck with them. The scratch of chalk on a board, the warm glow of lanterns during night classes, the sweet sound of violins echoing across camp yards. These memories carried more weight than the cold commands of their officers had ever done. Still, nothing influenced the Germans more than encounters with ordinary Americans, farmers, guards, children, outside of textbooks or concert halls. Cultural life inside the camps prepared them, but direct human contact outside the wire would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies. The real transformation came not through lectures or concerts, but in the simplest encounters, those that occurred when the barbed wire gave way to human contact. For German POWs, the paradox was of dictatorship, and for many, it sparked a reckoning. They had come as conquerors, convinced of Germany's superiority. Now, as prisoners, They saw a nation that produced more food than it consumed, built more cars than it needed, and still had room to treat its enemies with decency. The Reich had promised glory through fear. America offered prosperity through freedom. By the time the war ended, many prisoners no longer saw themselves simply as captives. They saw themselves as witnesses to another way of life. Some returned to Germany determined to rebuild it in that image, carrying stories of abundance and humanity across the Atlantic. Others applied for visas to return permanently, believing their future lay not in the ruins of Europe, but in the land that had fed them as enemies. In the end, the paradox was complete. These men had come across the ocean in defeat. They left not humiliated, but transformed. The last words of one POW capture the truth better than any statistic. America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its generosity. It conquered us without firing a shot.